investigators meeting. We have a packed schedule, so really no time to wait. Um, it's a really um, attractive agenda of items we have today. We have a few really interesting clinical investigators proposals, and then we have talks from um, funders and funding agencies, both from the NIH and PCORI, and then we have our invited speakers. And I will obviously let our amazing co-chairs introduce all of that. But I do want to start by thanking, first of all, thanking Dr. Laura Evans, Vice Chair for Discovery Research Network, and also Dr. Jerry Zimmerman, our past chair. I think both Laura and Jerry, it's been a great journey working on all of the various discovery activities that you're going to see today. And then also want to extend this thank you to both Vishaka and Tamara, amongst others, as our staff partners who have really worked very hard to really keep Discovery organized as we go through a phase of what I see as exponential growth and great growth. So thank you, team. It's been great, and obviously I look forward to a great 2024 and then a great future. In terms of what we've what we've done, I'll just spend a couple of minutes really quickly before I hand it over to our co-chairs. We've obviously worked on multiple projects, and you're going to see some of these come through at the SCCM 2025 Congress in Orlando. So as the Congress program comes through, please look at the program booklet and make sure that you mark some time for discovery sessions during Congress. That will really, we're trying our best to put through a program that really showcases what Discovery has done and continues to do for the betterment of critical care research. One of our highlights has been the Discovery Datathon. And again, it's a massive effort, and I've already thanked Vishak and tomorrow. I'm going to thank them again and thank the Discovery Datathon work group. Um, this has come through every year as a stronger than ever before program. This year we did it at the SCCM headquarters in Chicago. We had a great turnout and some great collaborations moving forward from the Datathon. Tamara, I think you can you advance this slide, please? All right, so I wanted to bring this slide up as I talk about precise. So what is precise? Precise is really our understanding of what is important with critical care research. As you all well know, a lot has been said about research priorities. We wanted to look at research priorities not just from the perspective of a few key stakeholders, but from the perspective of the entire SCCM membership. That's a very diverse membership. We also wanted to, at some stage, involve the patient's perspective into all of this. So Precise is just the beginning of all of that. Precise is a survey-based qualitative research project that will be kicking off soon. On the 16th of December, you all are going to receive a survey that's going to help you, that's going to ask you some very basic questions around research priorities, challenges, and what you believe are appropriate clinical outcomes measures for the trials that you and I do. This survey will be open for 2 weeks, and we ask you to participate. It will only take 5 minutes, I promise you. And please spread the word. The success of Precise depends on the engagement to the survey. The more responses we get, as you well know, really helps us get the true length and breadth of the SCCM membership, and helps us understand the most pressing issues in critical care that need to be addressed. And so every perspective should be adequately represented. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Discovery Clinical Investigators meetings, amazing co-chairs, Dr. Ankita Agarwal and Dr. Ana Leah Graciano. Leah and Ankita, thank you so much for this. I know you've worked very hard to put this together. I know it's going to be a fabulous investigators meeting. I encourage all of you to please stay online and please be available for the Q&A, especially after the clinical investigators proposals. The investigators would really benefit from feedback, and that's the real reason why they're here with us today. So Ankita and Analia, take it away, and thank you once more for all your efforts.
Thanks, Ashish, for that intro, and we'll jump right into it with our clinical investigator proposals. We're excited to have two excellent investigators presenting their proposals today. If you have any questions for the investigators regarding their proposals, please put the questions in the chat and they'll be addressed in a Q&A session after both investigators present. So first up, we have Dr. Perrin Cobb, who is one of the preeminent experts in the field of critical care surgery and medicine and director of the Surgical Intensive Care Unit at Keck Medical Center. So Dr. Cobb, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Excellent.
Okay, and there has been some background noise, so if folks could please make sure that they're muted so we don't have any extraneous noise during the presentation. Thank you. So I have the privilege of presenting on behalf of our group for accelerating quality improvement and research, acquire a new platform for a clinical quality registry for critical care. Next slide. You guys are driving. From a disclosure standpoint, I'm co-chair of the DoD work group for the Data Science Campaign, as most of you know, and I have industry affiliations with the companies listed here. Similarly, Dr. Jim Blum at the University of Iowa has a few industry affiliations listed there. Neither the companies nor their products will be discussed during this presentation. Next slide. So the first thing I want to do is to acknowledge and thank the incredible team that we have for Acquire. Several of them I noted are in the audience today. I don't have time to go over everybody due to the time constraints, but I just wanted to acknowledge Neil Barus at USC, Dr. Jim Blum leading the team at the University of Iowa, Dr. Karen Lutrick leading the team at the University of Arizona, and then Christina Kordick, who's the program manager supporting us in the SCCM Division of Quality and Research. Next slide. So from a 30,000-foot level, as the Society of Critical Care Medicine and its members explore opportunities in data science, there are really two opportunities, if you will, the two sides of the data coin, clinical research on one side and quality assurance and performance improvement on the other. As discovery investigators, we certainly have access to a rich library, if you will, of data and databases. I read recently that we've enrolled over 230,000 patients in the clinical research domain, so quite robust. On the other hand, if we look at what we have available for quality assurance and performance improvement with regard to benchmarking best practice in the US, that's quite limited. The Society of Critical Care Medicine did support a quality registry called Project Impact for several years, 1996, but it was sunset in 2004, 20 years ago, because of lack of funding. We know that's important to the best care that we provide.
You know what? Chicago. Hi.
KBC, can you mute, please? Thank you. Next slide. We know that's important from a clinical quality standpoint. I'll share one anecdote from the last clinical congress. An attendee got up at one of the ICU liberation discussions and said, so how are we doing post-COVID as far as compliance with A to F bundles? Are we doing the same, better, worse? And the presenter answered truthfully, and I'd say somewhat sadly, that we don't know. We don't have a mechanism to benchmark best practice with regard to the ICU liberation is only one example in the US, so that presents an opportunity. Next slide. We also know this is important from publications in our journal, CCM. This was published earlier this year by an international group reviewing national ICU registries as enablers of clinical research and quality improvement. Next. And from that article, clinical quality registries have been implemented worldwide by several medical specialties aiming to generate a better characterization of epidemiology, treatments, and outcomes of patients. We'll hear from some of those international leaders later in the program. National ICU registries were created almost 3 decades ago, and that would include Project Impact, to improve the understanding of case mix, resource use, and outcomes of critically ill patients. But again, Project Impact was sunset 20 years ago, and to date, certainly under the SCC umbrella, we don't have an opportunity. Next slide. So Acquire's goal is to create a clinical quality registry for critical care in the US. The hypothesis we're going to test is that social and environmental determinants of health, CEDO, impact A to F bundle compliance, which in turn impacts patient outcomes. The opportunity is to collaborate with the Society of Critical Care Medicine and its new Centers of Excellence on a data science foundation nationally for quality assurance and performance improvement. Next slide. From an innovation standpoint, if we look at registry science, a useful construct was published by Labkov and colleagues. The reference is at the bottom of the slide. Looking at the capabilities that are required for enabling registry science, they build like layers in a pyramid as depicted here. The foundational layer is the program layer, and whether an organization can provide access to patients as a large number of members has shown that it can demonstrate enrollment in patients, patient protection and privacy, et cetera. And our society can certainly do that. The next level up is the technology layer. We've certainly demonstrated that as well as far as capabilities through the Cure ID project that was funded by the FDA and NCAT sunset recently, but successfully enrolled data. Mona, can you mute yourself, please?
Excuse me, yeah, to all the audience, would you please just mute your phones? Thank you.
I'm muted too. I'll take the liberty of unmuting myself. So we've certainly demonstrated capabilities for technology in the society, and Discovery supported the Cure ID project to a common data model, OMOP, and we've demonstrated proficiency at the clinical intelligence layer of being able to demonstrate actionable insight from data that have been analyzed to improve patient outcomes through the IC Liberation campaign. So in the NIH R01 proposal to the National Library of Medicine that we plan on submitting October 5th, we've hopefully made a compelling argument. Next slide. Providing proof of feasibility for the scientific approach. Our aims are listed here that include feasibility, scalability, and sustainability. For feasibility, we'll demonstrate the Acquire platform at the University of Iowa and USC, 2 of the centers that were involved in the Cure ID OMOP project, demonstrating that we can map the data elements of the A to F bundle to OMOP as our common data model. We'll demonstrate scalability in AIM 2, curating a central registry at the Society of Critical Care Medicine, using a federated approach to create analysis data sets at the University of Iowa and USC loaded to the REDCap database centrally at the SCCM. And this, with regard to formal analysis and hypothesis testing, will be conducted by Dr. Lutrick and her colleagues at the University of Arizona. And then finally, for sustainability, creating a data science foundation working in partnership with the new Society of Critical Care Medicine Centers of Excellence program, which will be formally announced at the upcoming February meeting at the annual Congress, demonstrating a FHIR profile, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resource Profile for new sites. Next slide. As far as novel output and milestones, it'll include the first mapping of the IC Liberation A to F bundle elements to a common data model, that is OMOP, a new U.S. National Clinical Quality Registry for Critical Care, the Acquire platform, and a new data science foundation for ICU quality assurance and performance improvement through the FHIR protocol. Next slide. If we look from a if we look from a data management standpoint across the top, data elements, data model, and database, and then examine the current state, what we propose in the R01 and the SCCM Centers of Excellence, you can see in the upper left, the current state, that the data elements exist. Actually, the ICU liberation data standards have been published, and you can download it from the webpage. But as far as a common data model and a database, there are none, as we've described. In the R01 for AIM-1, we will take the ICU liberation Tier 1, which is focused on bundle compliance, and couple that with a tool that allows us to be able to identify social and environmental determinants of health. For a data model, we'll use OMOP as our common data model, similar to what we did with CureID. And then for a database, we will create a central database using the REDCap platform for Acquire initially. And then in parallel with the SCCM Centers of Excellence program, its data elements will be the same ICU liberation data standard for Tier 1, again, focused on compliance. And then in future years, Tier 2, which is focused on patient outcomes. The data model will be FHIR, and then the R01 and the SCCM Centers of Excellence program come together for AIM-3 as we ask that new institutions use the emerging FHIR standard for communicating data and sharing data with Acquire on FHIR, if you will. Next slide. From an operational standpoint, we have a technical group, the Extract, Transform, and Load, or ETL group, that's been meeting regularly for the last 9 months. Similarly, our social and environmental determinants of health group has been meeting together with our administrative core and a new advisory board. I'll share more with you on that in the next couple slides. Again, I don't have time due to time constraints to go over this data flow in detail, but suffice it to see the boxes in the center for USC and Iowa using our respective enterprise-wide clinical solutions, Cerner and Epic, and doing extract, transform, and loads locally to an OMOP-based data warehouse where we construct the analysis data set locally, which is then ported to the central SCCM REDCap database for future analysis. In the bottom center, you can see Hospital X, quote unquote, representing new additions using the emerging FHIR standard for sharing data. Next slide. From an eligibility standpoint, inclusion criteria are pretty straightforward. Anybody who's on supplemental oxygen up to and including mechanical ventilation, and the exclusion criteria are anybody who's expected to die within a short time of admission or anybody whose care goal is comfort. The data elements include the ICU Liberation Tier 1 for the new Centers of Excellence program, which has 17 parameters for A to F compliance and a few simple outcomes listed there. And then we're going to use the recently published CTSI tool, Social and Environmental Determinants Address Enhancement, which allows us to be able to look at a number of social and environmental determinants, including geographic ancestry, social vulnerability index, et cetera, as listed for you there. Next slide. And this is the final slide. We need your help. We've checked the box on obtaining a discovery letter of endorsement from the steering committee, and we are presenting here at the Discovery Clinical Investigators meeting. We have a new advisory board with our 3 subject matter experts listed here, including Julie Barr, who I believe is in the audience, Smitty Hebner, and Michelle Rowson, who I think are also attending. They and I would appreciate your help in revising the R01 proposal, which is due in about a month, October 5th, again, going into NLM as an R01. And we would appreciate your input at bi-monthly Acquire meetings to help steer the program. I appreciate your attention. I'd be happy to take any comments or questions during the discussion period, and you can reach me at my email listed in the bottom right. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cobb. Our next speaker is Dr. Romain Piracchio. He will present his proposal entitled One Day in the ICU. Dr. Piracchio is a professor and vice chair in the Department of Anesthesia at UCSF. He's also a professor of biostatistics in the Computational and Precision Health program at UCSF, and he's the Ronald D. Miller Distinguished Professor of Anesthesia and Perioperative Medicine. In addition, he is an associate and statistical editor for JAMA. and his research focuses on clinical AI and data science for acute care. Welcome, Dr. Piracchio.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to present. Can I ask you if I can share my slide? Oh, I think I can. So let me try to do that. It just makes a couple of changes to my slides. So I just want to make sure I'm using the last version. Can you see my screen? Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you again for the opportunity to present today, and I'm really excited to work with CCM on this project and to get feedback from this excellent group. So the title of the proposal is One Day in the ICU, and I'll try to explain you sort of the reason why we came up with this very extremely simple idea, which is essentially things started here. So we're a group that's been working on developing clinical AI models and clinical decision support tools for about 50 to 20 years now. And of course, as the field of clinical AI is evolving and maturing, one of the big question and concern that has been raised a couple of years ago already is the risk of bias especially towards underrepresented minorities with AI algorithm, and the risk of training algorithm on data that could include some sort of implicit bias that would then be perpetuated by virtue of launching this type of algorithm in practice. And so a few years ago, we started to look into sort of best practices to evaluate whether or not the algorithm that we're training were fair and equitable towards underrepresented minority or underrepresented subgroups. And as many others in this field were using data from the EHR, but also data from publicly available data sets. And when we started to work and try to again evaluate the performance of the algorithm in different subgroups, we came to the first conclusion, which was really interesting, which is that the data that is needed to essentially separate and differentiate different subgroups was not there in many of the data sets that we're using. And so we published this first paper a couple of years ago, where we essentially did a systematic review of all the publicly available data sets for critical care. And we screened them for the presence of variables that reflect simple characteristics such as age, signs, sex, gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And we sort of realized that for the vast majority of the publicly available data sets, this information was not available. So essentially, training algorithm based off on this data set is of course very powerful, but then it's difficult, if not impossible at all, to evaluate the performance of the algorithm in this specific subgroup if the information is not present out there. So, which sort of prompted us to question the availability of this data for the entire ICU population in the US. And we're like, well, if we don't know, if we cannot get this information from publicly available data set, at least what we would like to know is whether the studies and the algorithm that we're training on our own data set at UCSF are actually reflective of the general ICU population in the US. And when we started looking at that, we sort of realized that there's very, very little data that describes the demographics of the ICU population in the US. And the only fairly comprehensive paper that was published on this topic was actually published in 1993 in Critical Care Medicine. And since then, there's really no comprehensive description of the ICU population that essentially looks at the demographics of our critical care population in the US. And if we look at this sort of seminal paper from 1993, well, the paper was more really geared towards, I would say, structural and operational aspects in terms of describing the type of ICU care that we're providing in the US, and only sort of like scratched the surface in terms of describing the patients that we're taking care of in our ICUs with very sort of high-level characteristics, such as age subgroups, but really nothing more than that. So we sort of came up with the idea that we should try to collect demographic data in a systematic way on our ICU patients for two purposes. The first one is, well, essentially to sort of improve care or to work on care delivery processes with the idea that studying and addressing disparities in healthcare in critical care and actually requires access to this type of information. And the second goal, of course, is to improve our research and try to minimize the risk of biased results toward underrepresented population. And to do that, there's sort of like two aspects. The first one is that we want to make sure that we're including in our studies a patient population that is representative enough of the overall ICU population in the US. And so in order to do that, we need to be able to sort of refer to some data that describes this general population. And the second thing is, of course, when we are evaluating studies and results, we want to be able to sort of refer to this high-level demographic data to understand whether a given study is was actually performed in a sample that is or is not representative of the ICU population. So, and the sort of the third aspect is more around sort of the availability of the data in our EHR. And by discussing with several colleagues across the country, we sort of realized, and that of course includes ourselves, that a lot of the social determinants of health that should be present in the EMR are sort of rarely present, or a lot of us actually don't necessarily believe that the information that's present out there is of extremely high quality. So one of the sort of tertiary goal of this project is to try to collect information in terms of the availability of the information around social determinants of health, and also the confidence that providers have in terms of this information being reliable or not. So again, this is sort of the background that motivated us to design this so-called One Day in the ICU study, which is nothing more than a cross-sectional survey that aims at collecting aggregate de-identified data from a diverse range of ICUs across the country. And so we're designing this study with two different phases. The first phase will be a recruitment phase where we're willing to recruit site champions via the SCCM network and other networks. Following that, we will deduplicate the responses. The goal is to make sure that we're not going to get, the same data or data from the same ICUs during phase 2. So we want to make sure that we're going to get like one description for each one of the ICU that will be participating in the study. And so after this deep duplication phase, we will reach out during phase 2 to the champions, and we will try to collect the identified aggregated data from all the participating ICU via an online survey. So 3 goals. The primary goal is to gather demographic characteristics of our ICU patients across the US, including high-level sort of characteristic with age, gender, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and bunch of relevant health metrics. The secondary endpoints will be to characterize at a very high level. We're not intending to collect very detailed data, but we want to understand some of the high-level characteristics of the ICU participating in the study in order to be able to sort of understand high-level disparities in healthcare access. And the tertiary endpoint will be to collect the survey respondents sort of estimate of how often demographic data and social determinants of health are present in the EHR, and what's their confidence in the reliability of this data. So we believe that this type of data can be useful for several purposes. The first one, again, is to be able to promote health equity for our most vulnerable patient population. And in identifying trends and disparity can help inform future intervention. The second goal is to inform the design of future research studies, clinical trials, QI projects, and of course, when it comes to AI, which is really at the core and center of what we are doing in our group, this type of data is absolutely fundamental for us to be able to understand the risk of unfair or bias related to the use of clinical AI algorithms. And finally, related to our tertiary goal, we want to be able to inform efforts to increase the frequency and accuracy of data collection, especially concerning social determinants of health, which of course, as I'm sure you would all agree, are crucial to account for and to understand when we're analyzing outcomes in our patients. So in terms of tentative timelines, the first two milestones in terms of developing the survey and submitting the RB are both done. And so we're tentatively hoping that we will launch the phase 1 of the survey in late October, and potentially based on the result that we are able to collect during the phase 1, start the phase 2, which is the actual data collection, either in December or in January of 2025. That's all I have. Thank you so much, and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Piracchio. Now, we'd like to invite both of you, Dr. Cobb and Dr. Piracchio, for a brief Q&A. There were a few questions in the chat. One Dr. Cobb already answered. It was related to ability to capture the full range of social determinants of health, like, for example, Appalachian. And Dr. Cobb responded that yes. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but there is a link in his answer. Dr. Cobb, do you have anything else, sir?
Yeah, just add briefly. So that's obviously of major importance to the CTSI group. The tool was developed in collaboration with that group, and I think the short answer is yes. And I put the link to the publication of the tool, which includes the link to how to get to it. It's publicly available in the chat. So hopefully that'll answer anybody's questions. And then the second question that was asked is that obviously University of Iowa and USC are academic institutions. What about community hospitals? As I know my friends can appreciate, the $250K maximal available in an R01 split across 4 centers gets spent pretty quickly. So that's why we have the COE arm, the Centers of Excellence arm. We anticipate those two programs coming together in the later years of the R01. So certainly we look towards investigator participation from community hospitals. And if people would like to volunteer their time, that'd be great to move on that ASAP. We just don't have funding for it at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. There is a question from Ankita. Great proposals for Dr. Piracchio. How are you determining how many ICUs you need to survey to reasonably expect you have collected a large enough sample for generalizability?
Well, that's an excellent question, and of course, the more the better. So I would say that the number of ICU is certainly an important point. What we're really looking at more than the number is the mix of ICU that we will be including, and so that's the reason why we want to work with several networks to make sure that again, the mix of ICU will be as diverse as possible, meaning urban and rural hospitals, academic versus non-academic, and integrated versus non-integrated healthcare systems. So this is really what we'll be looking at in terms of trying to respect the proportion of each one of this type of ICUs that will be responding to the survey relative to the known proportion in the country. So I think that's really what we're interested in. Then, of course, maximizing the number of ICU will be important. I would say that if we're able to have the case mix that is reflective of the general case mix in the US in terms of ICUs, and we have anything, we have more than 20% of the total number of the ICU responding, that would be already extremely, that would be a very good result.
Thank you. Dr. Piracchio, have you done a power analysis?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, the thing with this type of cross-sectional data is that we can do a power analysis targeted towards confidence interval for the estimates, but there's really no sort of effect that we're trying to estimate here. So my straight answer is no, we have not. We could do that, but I'm not sure it's going to be extremely informative in this case.
Thank you. Julie Barr, you have your hand up. Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Dr. Piracchio's very interesting study. Can you speak more about how you're going to query the champions who are collecting this data in terms of how they interpret the quality of the data? I understand the binary aspect of missing data, but can you speak more about how they'll evaluate the quality of data that's in the EMR?
Yes, thanks, Julie. It's a very good question. So I think so the way we sort of frame the question right now is I would say very simple, and also I would say like the survey, needless to say, is designed to be extremely simple and quick to respond. Of course, there's always sort of like this trade-off between complexity of the survey and more information being gathered and better quality and sort of respondents rate, and so we want to be mindful of that. And so we try to keep the question extremely simple at this point. So to your specific question, Julie, we've used a semi-quantitative scale, Likert type of scale, for some very specific questions in terms of essentially, well, how often do you think social determinants of health data are available in your EHR? And there's like five possible answers. And how would you rate the quality of social determinants of health in your EHR? And again, Likert type of scale for that. So very simple. Which again, I acknowledge is not ideal in terms of really digging deep into that, but we try to make it really as simple as possible.
Thank you. Ashish, do you want to ask your question that is written in the chat?
Sure. Did you already ask or Raul had a question and a comment? Oh, I didn't want to skip over.
I'm sorry. No, I apologize. I didn't see it's a comment. It says partnering with someone like Epic Cosmos will help save a lot of time and resources for Dr. Piracchio's study. Thank you. I apologize. I didn't see that.
Thanks for that comment. It's a really great comment. Cosmos is a great resource, and there's some sort of challenges with that. The major one, to be completely frank, is that you have to be part of Cosmos, which is not the case of UCSF. So that's one challenge, which is a challenge to access the data, but it's also sort of a in and of itself sort of like biased the results towards like institutions who are on Epic, and we also decided to be part of Cosmos. So great resource, and we will try to get access to it. But I think we're also willing to explore sort of the data for institutions that are not part of Cosmos and Epic.
Thank you.
very quickly, Romain, first of all, thank you. And actually, thank you to both of you for excellent presentations. Romain, my question to you, sort of piggybacking on what Rahul just commented on, is, one part of the so-called burden here is the burden of the individual site champion then putting in data on, say, whatever, 50 or 100 ICU beds at a site. The other way to do it is to fully automate this process. But it looks like we're not quite there yet in terms of automating it because there's several hurdles to full automation, right?
Yes, unfortunately, I completely agree with you, Ashish, and I think it would be ideal. It would be ideal to have sort of like a generic and sort of global template that we could use to automate the query in Epic or in Cerner. And that's, I mean, it is very possible, but that would require substantial amounts of work with local Epic champions. So I see that to go in your direction, Ashish. I sort of like see that as the next steps, based on what we initially collect, and especially because I think there's going to be what I'm anticipating, to be quite frank, is that we're gonna get some data for very high level, some probably good data for very high level characteristics, right? Like age, race, ethnicity, like all that I think should be relatively reliable. For social determinants of health, I'm anticipating that the data will be pretty sparse, and so I think being able to automate the query around that will allow us, to continue to work on that with possible sort of intervention to improve the quality and the collection of this type of data within certain centers, and being able to monitor that through sequential sort of query of the data.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to take one more question, and then if there are any more questions, please put them in the chat, and the speakers will answer directly. Rahul, you are up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Just another comment on, I think on this group, there are several investigators. They had some experience with ICON and SIO studies. I think they was done 6, 7, 8 years ago, or a few years as well. Leaning on their experience, especially for the surveys and then the low response rate, that could be that I would strongly advise you to talk to them and see if you can learn from there, and then kind of incorporate some of the challenges they had it at the time or the success they had it at the time. I have to look up for the publications and maybe send it to you later on.
Thank you. So 2 excellent proposals and a really great discussion following. We'll move right along into our funder panel. For the funder panel, if there's any questions, please don't hesitate to write them in the chat, and we're going to make sure we have plenty of time at the end of the presentations for the questions. So if we can move the slides along. So first, we'll have Dr. Ken Santora. He's the Director of Division of Extramural Activities from the National Institute of Aging. Dr. Santora has been the Director of the Division of Extramural Activities at the National Institute of Aging since January of 2020. The Division of Extramural Activities provides leadership and oversight on extramural policies, scientific review, grants and contracts management, clinical research, and various training programs. Dr. Santora?
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me today. Next slide. So just to give a little short overview of what our institute is like, we are the 3rd largest institute now at the NIH. Just not 5 to 7 years ago, we were probably number 11, but we've gotten a tremendous amount of research dollars for, especially in Alzheimer's disease. And so we are now the 3rd largest. Our directors are Drs. Richard Hodis and Deputy Amy Kelly from the Division of Extramural Activities, which support 4 programmatic divisions at our institute: the Division of Aging Biology, which is our basic science division, the Division of Behavioral and Social Research, which handles all the economic, psychological, social, and behavioral research for the institute, the Division of Geriatrics and Clinical Gerontology, handles all our clinical research that is in aging, but not Alzheimer's disease, and then the Division of Neuroscience, which mainly houses much of our Alzheimer's disease research. Next slide. So I can't give a talk without giving a budget overview. The NIH as a whole has $48.6 billion, of which $4.5 billion goes to our institute at the Aging Institute. We did see, luckily this year, 2 increases, one in the area of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias of $100 million. And we also got $12.5 million dedicated for palliative care research. Next slide. We at our institute, we fund many different clinical trials overall. This is just a snapshot of our Alzheimer's disease and related dementias clinical trials, of which we have 507 currently active, 72 pharmacological and 159 non-pharm clinical trials. We have over 200 dementia care and caregiving trials, 19 of which are diagnostic tools, assessments, and imaging studies. We have 24 understanding disease processes trials and 7 treatment for neuropsychiatric symptoms trials. We have a similar amount. So we have literally over 1,000 protocols going on that are active right now for the entire institute. Next slide. Obviously, because of this tremendous growth and opportunities, we have a lot of opportunities that are available to the research community at our institute. We are signed on to or sponsor more than 200 active funding opportunities that allow for clinical trials. And just to remember, in the NIH system, you will always see in the titles that it's clinical trial either required or optional. Those are the ones that allow for clinical trials. If it does not allow, it should say it specifically. We also do have we approve a lot of concepts in our, especially this coming round in October at our councils, and you can get a snap view of what's on the horizon for our institute also. Next slide. Now I'd like to just go into a couple specific announcements for our institute that I just wanted to point out specifically. Of those 200 that we have signed on to, we have a program project. These are all unsolicited, actually, parent-like announcements, which are the majority of our clinical trials come in unsolicited. That means they're not into a targeted funding opportunity itself, and they're reviewed by the Center for Scientific Review. So that's the majority of ours. They can come in as PO1s, as U19s through our complex integrated multi-component project, Aging Research. We also have a multi-site clinical trial implementation grant, which is an R01 grant. And these are all, again, unsolicited and can be applied to in these particular announcements. Next slide. We also have opportunities for early stage and late stage clinical trials throughout the spectrum of Alzheimer's disease and age-related cognitive decline. So this is R01s. This is a specific RFA, but it is open for multiple years, and that's addressing gaps in screening for Alzheimer's disease. And then we have a specific, again, announcement for drug development program in Alzheimer's disease. And these are cooperative agreements, U01s, for various drug development and repurposing of drugs clinical trials. Next slide. And finally, a few other programs that I'd like to highlight too. These are all clinical trials allowed. one on structural racism measurements and modeling, another for early medical surgical specialists transitioning to aging research. This is the GEMSTAR program, and that's to get that next generation who's doing clinical trials. These are, you see it's RO3, but they're usually very small, but this is actually a more substantial RO3 program. We have an early stage clinical trial drug development program, but this is just for phase 1 and 2 that focuses on novel therapeutics. We have another biomarkers for Alzheimer's disease program. And then this one very unusual program called the Paul Beeson Emerging Leaders Career Development Award in Aging. And this one is clinical trial required, but it is a career award, a K award. So it's for early stage investigators. And then finally, the impact of sex differences on molecular determinants of Alzheimer's disease is another clinical trial required or optional, excuse me, opportunity. Next slide. And finally, I just want to point out some resources that I think are critical for applying to the National Institute on Aging. In my division itself, we do monitor and manage the CROME system, which is our clinical research operations management system. And this system, any clinical trial or clinical research that comes into our institute, this is the system in which all of the activity of that particular clinical trial, for say, through recruitment and all your major milestones is tracked in that system. And you can see it in real time, and it is a secure environment for that particular investigator and our program officers. And I'd like to also point out Outreach Pro, which is a tool that we have on our website that can actually help you develop websites, web material, posters, et cetera, for recruitment of underrepresented minorities. And these are, this system actually can develop these tools for you with, especially for recruitment of African Americans, Hispanic and Latinos, Chinese, Filipinos, and then Americans from India descent. And these are all been vetted through working groups and focus groups in with these particular populations. So it's a very good tool to help your recruitment. And finally, this last site, this recruitment and retention resources site, has everything you can imagine humanly possible for putting together a clinical trial application, all the templates, all the resources like DSMB plans, data sharing plans, protocol templates, informed consent, safety, et cetera. All of these examples and material are all found in these resource sites. Next slide. And finally, this is just an announcement that we do have a big Alzheimer's disease research summit that's focused on precision medicine this year, starting, it's on September 23rd and 25th. And I think that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Santora, for your detailed presentation. It was very informative. Our next speaker is Dr. Tessie October. Dr. October is a pediatric critical care and palliative and hospice medicine physician with advanced degrees from the University of Washington School of Medicine and Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. She currently serves as a medical officer in the Pediatric Trauma and Critical Illness branch of the UNIS Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which is the NICHD, within the NIH. And in this role, she manages and prioritizes research in pediatric critical care and palliative care. Welcome, Dr. October.
Thank you, Anna. Happy to be here. Next slide. In keeping with the theme that Ken started, that funders always talk about funding, I wanted to mention where NICHD falls in this among the institutes. We are at $1.7 billion compared to, as high as Ken stated, they're in the $4 billion range. And our priorities at NICHD are really around research for children and pregnant and lactating people. That being said, NIH as a whole spends about $4 billion, on pediatric research. So we at NICHD are not the only home for pediatric research. Your research can be funded across lots of institutes. And we also collaborate across institutes. Ken mentioned that NIA is leading the efforts in palliative care. That is an area that is really important, and we're glad that NIH has given NIA the lead. But there are quite a few institutes, NICHD being one of them, that still is participating in that funding announcement. So stay tuned for future funding around palliative care, because I know that's probably of interest to this group as well. Next slide. So within NICHD, we have this many, 12 scientific branches and the National Center for Medical Rehab and Rehabilitation, Rehabilitation Research. Next slide. Within there, we're palliative care research, where critical care research may fall in, is in our pregnancy and perinatology branch. That's where issues around OB-GYN, for example, critical illness might fall in. You also will find neonatal issues that populations will also fall into that research group. Next slide. The pediatric trauma and critical illness branch is where my research and my research portfolio lies. Really does focus on pediatric critical illness from outside of the neonatal period all the way through adolescence, and it includes the whole spectrum of disease from the pre-hospital, a resuscitation type of research in the field through early rehab. And the other institute right next to it, the Obstetrics and Pediatric Pharmacology, that's another institute where I have seen palliative care and critical care research go to within NICHD, and that's mainly going to be around drug trials. Next slide. I wanted to just highlight two things instead of giving you the whole compendium of all the things that we have, because it's hard to follow. One funding announcement in particular, or program that is specific for this group, is the Pediatric Critical Care and Trauma Scientist Development Program. It is a K-12 program that's run out of Utah, managed out of Utah, and it is designed for pediatric surgeons and critical care faculty who are looking for career development. It also is applicable for underrepresented minorities who are at the fellow critical care or the pediatric trauma fellowship level. I am the program officer for this program, so if you have questions, you could, contact me if you need more information. Next slide. And then this is not specific to NICHD. It is across the NIH. I do want to highlight the importance of the loan repayment program because it is, we for our own internal research that we've looked at NICHD, when people are funded with a loan repayment program, they are more likely to stay in academia and more likely to receive subsequent funding. And so NIH as a whole has taken this pretty seriously, and we want to encourage people to stay in academics and specifically in clinical research. And so there are quite a few loan repayment programs. The website is very big and hopefully it's clear, but if it's not, you can always reach out to the particular institute where your research lies. There's a contact page information for you. Within NICHD, there's the contraception and infertility research only comes to NICHD for the loan repayment program, but all the other ones are dispersed across the NIH broadly. And next slide, I think that's all I have for you. I'll stop there because I think we only go for another little bit and there's quite a few others left. So you guys can reach out to me for questions.
Thanks, Dr. October. That was really excellent. Next, we have Dr. Guifoy Zhou. Dr. Zhou is a program director at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, or the NHLBI's Division of Lung Diseases, where he also serves as acting branch chief for the Acute and Infectious Lung Diseases branch. He oversees an extensive research portfolio on conditions such as acute lung injury and ARDS.
Thank you, Akita, for the invitation and introduction. So next slide, please. So I want to start to state the NHLBI is committed to fund research in critical care space. I want to show some examples regarding ARDS, sepsis, and pneumonia. This slide shows the funding from 2008 to 2024. As you can see, from 2008, in each category, the funding is about $100 million. Now in 2024, the funding level reached to $160 million or $190 million. So as you can see, the funding has been steady, and from 2014, there's a steady increase as well. Next slide, please.
I'll get one for you.
Now, NHLBI-wide, we do have funding the majority of the critical care research among NIH. As you can see, in the last 10 years, NHLBI funded about 68% of projects in ARDS field, and the budget-wise, NIH contributed to about 74% of the total spending in ARDS research. Next. NHLBI support a broad spectrum of research topics in critical care space, ranging from basic and preclinical research to clinical population science research, as well as implementation research. Next, please. In clinical trial space, we have a suite of funding opportunities ranging from early phase clinical trials to the later phase clinical trials. These including single-site clinical trials, multi-site clinical trials, and we also have a pilot study, which is for studies to be sufficient and necessary for the next phase of clinical trials. For mechanistic clinical trials, we have a parent album mechanism. You can come in to apply. Next, please. So NHLBI has particularly interest in the research and the infrastructure building in ARDS domain. About 30 years ago, NHLBI started the ARDS network. It lasts for 20 years. Research results from that network has been adopted by clinical practice nowadays, as many of you are very aware of. And after ARDSnet, NHLBI funded a paddle network, which is focusing on the prevention and early treatment of acute lung injury. However, regardless the extensive effort in this domain, we still don't have any effective pharmaceutical therapy for ARDS patients. So one key barrier is the heterogeneous nature of ARDS and the patient in the critical care space. So to address this issue, NHLBI, with generous co-funding from NIGMS, started the ARDS Pneumonia and Sepsis Consortium last year. So within a short time period of 1 year, they already start enrolling patients. The first patient enrollment is on July 25th, 2024. So actually, our next panelist, Dr. Laura Reineck, spearheaded this consortium when she was with us 2 years ago. Next, please. So APS consortium has 1 coordinating center and 6 clinical centers with 22 clinical sites. Next, please. The goal is to have a consortium-wide prospective longitudinal observational study. It also contains 6 hypothesis-driven clinical center-specific projects. The plan is to enroll 4,000 adult hospitalized with ARDS and or pneumonia and or sepsis with a follow-up at 3, 6, and 12 months. So as you can see in the right, the scheduled events, we have APS going to have a extensive collection of data and about specimens. And these data and about specimen will be available for the broader research community for them to have access or request for ancillary studies. So request for ancillary studies, you can go to the apsconsortium.gov to have the access or submit the requests. Next, please. all these research effort needs to have a sustainable workforce to be able to carry out all these work. So NHBI is committed to support the training and the research community, career development. So we have a suite of funding options across the career path. We have the training from individual fellowship all the way to the career mechanism to the established PGs, for example, R35 and the program projects. We also have institutional training grants, T32 and T35. So as Cassie mentioned, we also support a loan repayment program to be able to recruit and retain the talented investigators. Next, please. As you all know, the biomedical research career is a long journey. Many things can happen along the way. There are a lot of transition time, transition phase, and branching points. So NHBI is very aware of this. So we try to recruit, retain all these talent in our workforce to really enhance the pipeline. So we do have a few supplement funding to offer to our investigators, especially for the early stage investigators. The first one is diversity supplement. We support a very broad definition of diversity. So investigators come in to support their team as themselves. And we also have a supplement for re-entry and reintegration programs. That one, for some reason, if you have any interruption from your career, your research career, you can also apply to this mechanism for funding. Of course, a lot of events along the way, for example, adoptions, childbirth, or other life critical events can happen. So NHBI also support life event supplements as well. So all these supplements, they have money available for you to come in, and the NHBI is very strongly support of these research endeavors. So NHBI also committed to support the research community with all kind of resources. For example, BioLink. BioLink will provide biospecimens collected from the consortiums or network funded by NHBI for your secondary analysis, and they are free of charge. So you can reach out to have access of these resources. We also have a biodata catalyst. This is about the data, especially what you get talking about the EMR data. So you'll be able to have access and to do the analysis based on your application and your needs. NHBI is also committed to the translational science. We have a catalyzer program. This program is focusing on the early translation of technology or device. For example, you have device, small molecule compounds, or biologics. This is within the catalyzer domain. So we have a coordinated center to help you to go through all the regulatory process or very beginning for the IND applications as well. So this the resource and funding, especially important for early stage investigators or the investigators that are looking into the translational space. Next, please. So I want to conclude my presentation that NHBI is committed to support research in critical care space. We are here to support you. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zhu. That was really interesting to hear about, especially about the APS consortium. So next we have Dr. Laura Reineck. She is the Director of Clinical Comparative Effectiveness Research, or the CER program at the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. Her work focuses on comparing the effectiveness and safety of alternative healthcare options to help patients and providers make informed decisions.
Thanks so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today and to talk to you about PCORI's funding opportunities. I just wanted to point out that my email address is on this slide. So if there's questions that come up after this presentation today, you are more than welcome to reach out to me. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to start out with a brief introduction about PCORI, or the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute. So PCORI is an independent nonprofit research organization that funds comparative clinical effectiveness research, or CER. And the findings from these studies help patients and other stakeholders make better informed decisions. Next slide, please. So one of the key ways that research funded by PCORI is different is that we engage patients and other stakeholders throughout the research process. And we're committed to ensuring that they have a seat at the table, helping to prioritize research topics, design and conduct the studies, and share the results. And as I mentioned earlier, PCORI funds CER, which compares 2 or more medical treatments, services, or health practices to help patients and other stakeholders make better informed health and healthcare decisions. And our funded work focuses on answering the questions most important to patients and those who care for them, and to produce evidence that can be applied in real-world practice settings. Next slide, please. Since its authorization by Congress in 2010, PCORI's awarded more than $4.5 billion to fund nearly 2,400 research and research-related projects. And the heart of PCORI's work is funding patient-centered comparative effectiveness research, which I'll talk more about in the next 2 slides. But I also wanted to mention that there's a couple of other award types that we fund. So we fund engagement awards, which are projects aimed at bringing more patients, caregivers, clinicians, and other healthcare stakeholders into the research process. We also fund dissemination and implementation projects to promote awareness of findings from PCORI-funded research and to facilitate the uptake of research finding in practice. And last, we also fund research infrastructure that aims to accelerate patient-centered outcome research, such as PCORI. Next slide. So this slide gives you a quick overview of PCORI's research award funding opportunities. So the first one listed is the placer mechanism, or the phased large awards for comparative effectiveness research. So this is a phased mechanism, and it supports large-scale, high-impact randomized trials in CER who have some risk in achieving their research aims. So there's a feasibility period prior to transitioning to the full-scale trial phase. And applications can request up to $22 million in direct costs and 6.5 years of funding, with 1.5 years for that feasibility phase and 5 years for the full-scale phase. And these applications can focus on any health disease or condition, including critical care areas. BPS, or the Broad Pragmatic Studies, this funding opportunity seeks applications for high-quality CER projects, and it's offered every cycle. So like placer, applications can focus on any health disease or condition, including critical care. And these applications can request up to $12 million in direct costs for over 5 years. The next cycle funding opportunity is for methodologic research to improve the design and conduct of CER. And the methods PFA is offered every cycle, and applications can request up to $750,000 in direct costs and 3 years of funding. Science of engagement is a funding opportunity that's looking for projects that identify methods and approaches that lead to effective engagement in research. And depending on the type of study that's proposed, applications can request up to $1.5 million in direct costs and 3 years of funding. And the last one that's listed on this slide are focused funding opportunities. And these vary from cycle to cycle, and they're sort of similar in concept to RFAs at NIH. So examples from the recent past include a funding opportunity focused on sleep health and rare diseases. And the focused funding opportunity this cycle, for cycle 3 of 2024, is for applications focused on promoting healthy children and youth. Next slide. Thank you. So the CER applications that we accept are in response to placer, BPS, and those focused funding opportunities that I mentioned. But I wanted to go over, for a CER application to be considered responsive, the things that we're looking for. So first, it's essential to describe the comparatives, and whether the proposed study is a clinical trial or an observational study, all of the research projects must compare at least 2 alternatives. And if usual care is proposed as one of those alternatives or comparators, then it needs to be described in detail and properly justified. Additionally, the outcomes have to be endorsed by patients and be health related. Next, the two comparators or alternatives being compared each have to have established efficacy or be in widespread use. So PCORI expects that the efficacy or the effectiveness of each of the interventions is already known. And if the efficacy or evidence base is insufficient, then there needs to be data provided to document that the intervention is used widely. So those projects that are aiming to develop new interventions that lack evidence of efficacy, effectiveness, or widespread use are considered our scope for PCORI. And third, applicants have to propose research that studies the benefits and harms of interventions and strategies delivered in real-world settings. So we're interested in studies that provide practical information that can help patients and other stakeholders make informed decisions about their healthcare and health outcomes. And last, applications need to describe meaningful engagement with patients and other stakeholders, as well as how the study is answering a critical question that represents a decisional dilemma for patients, caregivers, clinicians, and other stakeholders. Next slide, please. So PCORI staff are happy to talk to you if you have any questions. So you can ask to speak to one of our program officers by emailing the inbox sciencequestions@pcori.org. And it's helpful for us if you can include a little information about what you'd like to discuss or what your project's about so that we can make sure we connect you to the right person. And you can also take a look at our website to look at the funding announcements and other resources. Next slide. And last, you can sign up for PCORI emails to receive notifications of our funding opportunities at the website listed here. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. So there was one question in the chat for Dr. Santora about suggestions for critical care investigators and how to find alignment with NIA opportunities and priorities. And I know you answered a little bit of that in the chat, but if you wanted to expand on that.
Right. As with my colleagues and that just spoke to, it's best to send me some information directly, you know, like you have an abstract of what you're considering doing or some information regarding the type of research, excuse me, and we can match you then directly with the program officer that's in charge of that portfolio. With that, they know always what types of opportunities there are for research in that area, or maybe opportunities too to collaborate with other investigators or within our big centers or networks and different resources that you may be wanting to use for the development of an application. So please just send me, as I wrote in the chat, my email, and I'd be happy to link you up with the appropriate person. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Santora. So if for all of our attendees, if you have other questions for any of our speakers, you know, feel free to reach out to them directly, or if you think of something to place in the chat. Thank you to all of the NIH speakers and for your presentations. I think they were really informative. And for me, as an early career person, I think I need to chew on it a little bit more. So I will pass it over to Analia to move us to our educational lectures.
Yes, thank you again to all the faculty who has presented so far. Very exciting and very useful information. So there is more to come. Now we have 3 lectures that will address diversity in critical care trials. Our first speaker is Dr. Erin Paquette, who will be presenting bias in clinical trial enrollment. Dr. Paquette is an associate professor at Northwestern University School of Medicine in the Department of Pediatrics, and a professor at Northwestern as well, School of Law. She is also an attending physician in the Pediatric Critical Care Medicine Department at Lurie Children's Hospital. She's chair of the Ethics Advisory Board, director of Clinical and Organizational Ethics at Lurie Children's as well, and a member of the steering committee for the Northwestern University Institute for Public Health and Medicine Center for Bioethics and Humanities. Dr. Paquette is a member of the SCCM Ethics Committee and a board member of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities. Research focuses on disparities, including disparities in research participation. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you for that introduction and for the opportunity to join you today. There is some background noise, so I apologize. Let me know if you have difficulty hearing me.
Good.
Can you go to the next slide?
It's good.
So I do have some funding disclosures. All noted here. My research that I'll be presenting on today is supported by a Third Development Award through the National Institute for Child Health and Human Development. And then this is an academic disclosure. I work in multiple roles, so you might hear about these throughout my presentation. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about participation by diverse groups in research, barriers to research participation by diverse groups, bias as a specific barrier, and explain why over and under representation in research is problematic. And finally, I'll review some strategies to restore proportionate representation in research. Next slide. So we know from a number of studies that there is lower representation of racial and ethnic minorities in research. For example, 78% of participants in clinical trials are non-Hispanic white participants, but these only make up 61% of the general population. And this demonstrates disproportionate overrepresentation in research. Furthermore, we know that subgroup specific study results and analyses for racial and ethnic minorities are often missing. In addition, however, there are other aspects of diversity that are poorly represented in research. There is lower representation of women in research, specifically pregnant and lactating women, and there are missing subgroups of racial and ethnic minorities that are missing for women in research. Finally, there are lower representation of those living in rural compared to urban settings, where rural residents represent 14% of the population, but only 3% of clinical trials related to cancer. This is a problem in underrepresentation. And lastly, sexual and gender minority populations are underrepresented. And this underrepresentation is actually quite difficult to quantify because in most cases, sexual orientation is not actually collected.
Erin, I apologize, I interrupt you. It seems like there is a lot of background disturbance on your end. So I don't know if that can be fixed or if the other attendees are able to hear very well, and Keith and I had some difficulty.
Let me see if I can change the input. Does that make it any better?
That's actually a lot better on my end.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's better. Definitely.
All right. I'll go ahead and continue then. Yes. Okay, can you get the next slide? What we've noted is that underrepresentation in research mirrors those that are at risk for health disparities. So using the NIMHD research framework for health disparities, populations that are most likely to be at risk for disparities in diagnosis and outcomes in healthcare are racial and ethnic minority groups, those of lower socioeconomic status, those in underserved rural communities, sexual and gender minority populations, and people with disabilities. This impacts health at individual, family, community, and population levels. And it mirrors, like I said, our failure to represent these populations in research. Obtaining better health outcomes will require us to restore proportionate representation in research for these populations. Next slide. So what I didn't present on thus far is representation in critical care research, which is an area that I've been working in. We've discovered that minority children are both over and under represented in acute care or emergency and critical care research. So this graph
shows you both over and under representation. The 0 line represents proportionate representation. A deflection above the line represents over-representation, and below the line, under-representation. Looking at over 62,000 participants across 9 studies in pediatric critical care and emergency care research networks, we see deflections both above and below the 0 line, showing that there is both over and under representation. Next slide. If we break this down by some specific minority racial ethnic groups, non-Hispanic Blacks are both over and underrepresented, showed by the red arrows on this graph. Next slide. Non-Hispanic Whites are largely overrepresented. Next slide. And Hispanic populations are both over and underrepresented. Next slide. When we've looked into further, what are the barriers to research participation by diverse groups? Historically, these 3 barriers have been the most common to pop up. One is willingness to participate in research. However, studies that have looked at willingness to participate show that there's actually equal stated willingness among racial and ethnic minorities to participate in research, as well as by rural populations. And this counters the idea that willingness to participate is actually driving lower participation. Now, notably, this is stated willingness where observed consent and participation rates may vary, but this may actually be a misperceived barrier. A second barrier is distrust or mistrust in research, and this is linked to historical abuses, which I'll show in just a moment. However, some studies also counter that level of trust does not predict willingness to participate. And finally, another issue that has arisen is participant bias towards research team or from participants towards the study based on study characteristics. And we'll review each of these on the next slides. Next slide, please. So first, with respect to distrust, while there have been studies that have countered distrust in the research enterprise, there has been quite a history of broken trust with African American and Latinx communities. We've largely, many studies have focused on the Tuskegee and Willowbrook studies, which looked at the natural history of syphilis and hepatitis, respectively. There have been multiple abuses that date back to the 1850s and have extended to as recently as 2022, when ivermectin, which was deemed by the FDA not to be an appropriate therapy for COVID, was given to Black inmates in an Arkansas jail. So this timeline, I won't go through each of the studies on it, but this timeline demonstrates that the road to distrust has been long and persistent. And so we still, while there are some studies that counter trust as an issue, we have to face the history and be transparent and accountable to the history of abuses against these populations in research. Next slide. We have actually done a prospective analysis of children at risk for health disparities, where we've shown that there's a proportionate approach in enrollment, but possible participant biases that are present in research participation. So we looked at 17 emergency and critical care research studies and collected demographic data for participants that were eligible for these studies, as well as from research coordinators. We adjusted for study level factors, including the consent mechanism, intervention, status of the trial, whether it was interventional or observational, and risk level, and looked at the potential for implicit bias on both the side of the research team as well as the participants in the study. From the research team, we asked research coordinators to complete 3 Harvard Implicit Association tests. And we also looked at their rates of approach of enrollment and enrollment by race and ethnicity of the research participants. When we looked at research approach in our bivariate analyses, we found there was higher approach associated with private insurance, written consent, and female research coordinators. And when we did multivariable analysis, we found that only the presence of a female research coordinator increased the likelihood of approach of all participants, not just those of racial and ethnic minorities. When we looked at enrollment data on bivariate analyses, we found lower enrollment rates associated with children who were at risk for health disparities, non-white, and these were children of non-white race ethnicity, public insurance, low childhood opportunity index. And we also found lower enrollment among studies where there was a consent waiver, where there were interventional studies and where there were higher risk studies. However, on multivariate analysis here, only likelihood of enrollment was associated with female CRCs and verbal consent. In neither approach nor enrollment did we find that race and ethnicity of the participants impacted either of these levels. The association for CRC implicit bias with approach or enrollment also did not reach statistical significance. However, the multivariate results that suggested the presence of a female CRC and the use of verbal consent increasing enrollment suggest the potential for participant preferences or bias playing a role, which is an understudied area in looking at enrollment of diverse groups in research. Next slide, please. So in general, study and team level barriers to research participation include not offering the opportunity to participate, where this has been characterized as a risk for implicit or explicit bias. And I'll give you some data from one study that supports this. The mechanism of consent, as I described, where informal consent mechanisms can impact whether the consent mechanism is formal versus informal, can impact likelihood of participation, the type of study, whether it's interventional or observational, and the risk level. Next slide. In one study looking at implicit bias from the standpoint of study teams towards participants, it underscored the need for clear inclusion and exclusion criteria to eliminate the potential for thoughts that bias were impacting approach rates. So in this study, investigators did a secondary analysis of a trial in bronchiolitis comparing scheduled versus as needed follow-up visits for admission for bronchiolitis. Of 548 eligible participants, they found that 506 were approached and 42 were deemed inappropriate to approach. The reasons for approach were not well defined, and they found that there was a higher rate of Hispanic participants in the group deemed inappropriate to approach compared to their overall representation in the study population. And they thought that this could reflect implicit bias towards the Hispanic population, potentially based on health literacy or thoughts about their willingness to participate. And they concluded that there's a need to have clear inclusion and exclusion criteria to eliminate discretion playing a role in the decision to approach or not approach a potential participant, which would reduce the risk for implicit bias. Next slide, please. Beyond bias, however, there are study factors that are associated with study enrollment. In this study that we conducted, we looked at both study and participant level factors potentially impacting enrollment. I'll focus you on the left side of this graph that shows study level factors. And here the red line denotes an odds ratio of 1, such that if the odds ratio is above 1, that means that that factor led to increased enrollment, and where it's below 1, decreased enrollment. Next slide. Here we found that non-Hispanic Black participants had differential enrollment based on several study-related factors. They had an increased odds of enrollment if there was an informal consent mechanism, so either verbal consent or waiver of consent. And they had increased odds if there was an intervention versus an observational study. They had a decreased odds of having been enrolled where there were formal consent mechanisms, such as written consent and assent. Next slide. Hispanic participants had increased odds of having been enrolled if there was a formal consent mechanism, so opposite pattern, or if there was a waiver of consent or an interventional study, they had a decreased odds of enrollment. So their patterns of enrollment were opposite those of the non-Hispanic Black population. Next slide. Those who were of other race, which we believe may have been other Hispanic race, also had increased odds of enrollment if there was a formal consent mechanism and an intervention versus an observational study here, or decreased odds of enrollment, whether we're informal consent mechanisms, such as verbal and waiver of consent. Next slide. We've also conducted studies looking at retention of research participants. In this study, we did a retrospective review of a multi-site randomized trial of a PICU-based navigator support intervention to assess if approaching, enrolling, and retaining participants was associated with sociodemographic and patient clinical factors. Of 1,050 screened individuals, there was proportionate decrease in return of study surveys that were done at discharge, 3 to 5 week and 3 to 5 months. Next slide. When we looked at the factors that influenced whether surveys were returned at each of these time points, the thing that I'd like you to note about this slide is that more factors play a role the further out you are for enrollment, suggesting that there may be more social factors coming into play that decrease the participation, the ability to participate in research the further one is away from their initial enrollment in a research study. We did find that both race and ethnicity at this further time point impacted the odds of returning a survey, where it was lower at the 3 to 5 month time point for racial ethnic minorities. Also lower education, having siblings, lower income, decreased participation, being of single versus married or partnered status, decreased rates of return, and higher illness severity also decreased rates of return. Next slide, please. Finally, we did a study looking at retention by health disparity status, as I mentioned, that NIMHD framework for health disparities. You can go to the next bullet point. And here we characterize retention in a multi-site study of pain management of long bone fractures in the emergency department. Here, there was a text-based response required at various time points, and we looked to see whether there was any response by different groups or complete text response. Next slide, next bullet. We found in this study that the majority of children enrolled actually met a health disparities population. So where we think of racial ethnic minorities being under-enrolled in research, here we actually found that if you broaden your conception of diversity, there actually is quite a bit of diversity or risk for health disparities in enrolled research participants. Next slide. We found that disparity status was associated with the lower odds of any text response. So these boxes here, both unadjusted and adjusted, had lower odds of response or a complete text response. Next slide. When we characterize response rates by the number of factors that made one at risk for health disparities, we found that there was a decreased odds of response with the more health disparities factors that were present. And this suggests that there is intersectionality of these factors such that the more that you have, the less likely you are to be able to participate in research over time. Next slide. So the combination of this data suggests that there's both over and underrepresentation in research, and this is problematic for multiple reasons. Next slide. Most importantly, it undermines concepts of justice as fairness by violating the second claim that John Rawls stated in his conception of justice, was that when looking at distribution of social and economic goods, the least well-off should be made better off by any difference in whatever good you're distributing. So in this case, next slide, when we think about distribution of research enrollment, when you have an unfair distribution of research enrollment, you unfairly distribute the benefits and burdens of that research. And that violates this principle of justice because the inequality here doesn't necessarily benefit the least well-off, where they may gain access to a treatment in a research protocol or other benefit that they're not getting by being underrepresented. Furthermore, it threatens study feasibility and validity and generalizability. Next slide. In order to restore justice, we need to think about person and study level or systemic level factors that are involved in research. Next slide. There have been several strategies suggested to increase proportionate representation in research. First is to act intentionally about achieving representativeness. Second, to establish trust with participants as well as the community. To anticipate and remove barriers to participation. To have flexible recruitment and data collection. To build a robust network by involving all stakeholders. Navigate professional, peer, and also societal expectations of your research. To optimize the study team to align with research goals, including diversity of the study team, and to attain support and resources that allow you to achieve proportionate representation. Next slide. I'm going to have flip through these next several slides very quickly, which is where I'm going to conclude. But I wanted to demonstrate this framework for the timeline of recruitment science. It starts from the research question and extends all the way to enrolling and retaining somebody in research. And where we tend to focus on these middle boxes of meeting regulatory requirements for consent and assent, we need to move upstream and downstream to think about the things that we can do to improve proportionate enrollment and retention. Next slide. You can actually go to the next slide from here. So what we've proposed is an idea of adaptive engagement, where you identify at each level whether you're achieving your intention to make proportionate representation. And if not, that you reevaluate at that time step your approaches to enrolling diverse groups and change where you need to improve your proportionate representation. I'm going to just ask if you can flip through the remaining slides. Just give it a second to each slide. There are questions that you can ask at every time point where you review and adapt your approach throughout the research timeline. Next slide. So asking, is the research question responsive to the community? Next slide. Does the study design risk excluding disparities, populations? Next slide. What are your study framework for recruitment? How does that match up with the likelihood that you'll reach your disparities populations? Next slide. Are you measuring health literacy and assessing understanding in the consent and assent process to make sure that a declination to participate is well informed? Next slide. Thinking about things like differential compensation, reimbursement, or incentive to improve enrollment by underrepresented groups. The next slide. And finally, thinking about things that we may not traditionally reimburse for, the use of trusted messenger or graduated payments when you're thinking about retention. Next slide. So with that, I will thank you for listening. I apologize for exceeding the time and the sound difficulties. You can reach me here with any questions, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Paquette. That was a really interesting talk, and I recognize the difficulty of containing all this information. Our next speaker is Dr. John Marshall from St. Michael's Hospital, and he will discuss inclusion of low middle income countries in large-scale registries and trials and the challenges, opportunities, and impact. Dr. Marshall is a professor of surgery and critical care medicine at the University of Toronto. He is the chair of the International Forum for Acute Care Trialists, a senior editor of critical care medicine, co-chair of the WHO Working Group on the Characterization and Management of COVID-19, and a passionate champion of global collaboration in acute care research. Looking very much forward to this, Dr. Marshall.
Well, thanks very kindly, Ankita, and thanks for the introduction. I wonder if I can have my slides. These aren't the slides for my talk. But I also really appreciate the opportunity to be part of the discussions today and to sort of share some thoughts that I have on issues of diversity and inclusion in acute care research. If you could maybe put that in slideshow mode, that would be great. And move on to the next slide. Oh, are you able to hear me? Things seem to, there we go. Yep. So these are my conflicts for the talk this afternoon. I think my most important conflicts are academic. As you mentioned, I'm a real fan of the concept of global collaboration and research. Next slide, please. So I think when it comes to looking at equity and inclusion at a global scale, the issues are somewhat different because we're really talking about trying to, as much as possible, represent the entire world. And therefore, the issue is not so much inclusion, which suggests joining somebody else's work, as it is partnering. And I think that's the idea that I want to get across today, the underlying theme for this particular talk. Next slide, please. So first of all, it is apparent that there are striking disparities in access to research around the world. Most biomedical research comes from high-income countries, whether looking at the number of trials or the expenditure of dollars on health research and development. And you can appreciate that there is very little work being done in low-income countries. In addition, high-income countries spend more money on clinical trials than do lower-income countries. But I would note here that even with that, percentage of GDP spent on biomedical research is less than 0.3%, which I think can be criticized as really being inadequate if we're going to provide high-quality care to patients around the world. Next slide, please. So a question occurs, why should we be thinking about globalizing acute care research? Well, there's some simple answers. Obviously, it increases the efficiency. If we can recruit more patients into a clinical trial, we can do subgroup analyses and we can really begin to understand variability in response to therapy. We can expedite the completion of clinical trials and therefore be more efficient in translating that information to inform patient care. But then we can also increase the generalizability, because what works in one particular hospital or one particular country may not work in another hospital or another country. And being able to understand the interplay between health system variables and treatment variables is really important. It's important to expand the focus of research to address problems that are global in character. And some of the major causes of morbidity in low and middle income countries are really understudied. Diseases like dengue, for example, which is very relevant to intensive care, is not studied because we're not having trials led by low and middle income countries. And I think particularly coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's apparent that globalizing and collaboration is critical if we're going to respond effectively to pandemics or other emergency needs. So these are all areas that require conscious attention to build capacity. Next slide, please. So just to illustrate this, this was a very nice meta-analysis published earlier this year in the Blue Journal, looking at the impact of fluid volume on resuscitation of sepsis, and making the point that if you are in a lower middle income country, aggressive fluid resuscitation is in fact harmful, presumably because of lack of access to facilities to deal with the complications of fluid resuscitation. But I think as we look at things that are so fundamental to the management of critically ill patients as initial resuscitation, and realize that the application of certain principles varies depending on the context within which they're applied, it's important that we really look at the problem from a global perspective. Next slide, please. So I think it's reasonable to say that COVID-19 has marked an inflection point in the way that we conduct and increasingly the way that we think about clinical research. It's really quite remarkable if you look at the extent to which the entire world responded with research to COVID-19. Close to 10,000 registrations on clinicaltrials.gov, studies emerging from over 140 different countries, and reflected in more than 430,000 entries in PubMed, all in the space now of just over 4 years, 4.5 years. And so it's these changes that I want to kind of speak to in this talk. Next slide. So during COVID-19, we've really begun to see large-scale thinking about how we conduct research, not so much the small multi-center clinical trials that may be national or registries that are national in character, but really thinking about how do we globalize these initiatives. Here's one example, the ISRIC Coronavirus Consortium, which recruited close to 1 million patients with COVID-19 and gathered data on the virus and its clinical manifestations around the world. And you can appreciate here, this was taken from a study reported when there were just over 600,000 patients, but over half of those patients came from Africa. And so we really are getting a picture of what COVID-19 looked like at global scale. With perhaps the exception of North America, we were not all that well represented in that particular database. Next slide, please. Another important international collaboration is the LOGIC collaboration led by Jorge Salu in Brazil. This is a database that is primary role is in benchmarking, but it has grown over the years. It now includes more than 1,500 ICUs around the world and has data on more than 7 million admissions. And so again, you can see that it's in a position where it becomes reasonable to think about describing what is happening at global scale. Next slide. Registries are found really around the world, and there's some very innovative ones. The Critical Care Asia and Africa collaboration led by Roshan Hanifa and Abby Bean uses a database of ICU patients from Southeast Asia and Africa. But beyond simply reporting the outcomes of these patients and understanding the clinical course there, they have now been able to use the database as a platform for data collection in the context of randomized clinical trials. And so for the REMAP-CAP trial, which I'll say a few words about, we had over 400 patients recruited from Nepal, for example, through this registry database. Next slide, please. So REMAP-CAP was a platform trial that was developed before the pandemic, but really matured and blossomed during the COVID-19 pandemic, recruits patients from most parts of the world. We're underrepresented in Africa and South America, although that is changing now. Next slide. During the pandemic, recruited about 10,500 patients with COVID-19, critically ill patients with COVID-19. And so we're able to generate conclusions about a large number of interventions that either worked or didn't work. We published 14 papers, and 11 of these were either in JAMA or the New England Journal of Medicine. Next slide, please. Now, beyond a simple platform trial like REMAP-CAP, the pandemic has also shown us that trials and trial platforms and trial groups can work together and collaborate in conducting research. This was the collaboration of REMAP-CAP with the ATTACK trial and the ACTIV-4 trial of the NIH, looking at anticoagulation in severe COVID-19 and showing there were differential effects depending on whether you were critically ill, where heparin was harmful, versus moderately ill, where full heparinization was actually beneficial. But this kind of collaboration allowed roughly 3,000 patients to be recruited in a period of 6 months. And obviously was very, very important in expediting the generation of new knowledge during the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. Thinking about other models of large trials, the MEGAROCKS trial that's being led from New Zealand is using registry type approaches to recruit 40,000 patients to a clinical trial that will evaluate oxygen saturation targets in ICU patients. And it will have the power to detect small but clinically important effects and also to look at some distinct subgroups. Next slide, please. So coming out of the pandemic, I think there's been a heightened awareness on the part of ICU researchers around the world that we really need, that we've learned a lot and that we need to change the way we do things and to really harness our collaborations more effectively, both to respond to future pandemics, but also to build a healthcare system in which research is embedded into the provision of care. And so we held a colloquium on this theme, on the lessons of COVID-19 last fall, attracted clinical research groups, over 40 of them from over 40 different countries, to discuss this. Next slide. And one of the key messages, I think, that emerged from that, and in turn emerged from thinking during the pandemic, is the critical role that investigator-led research networks like Discovery play in informing clinical care of ICU-based patients, and that the concept that there really has to be new thinking and new money put into funding networks at regional and national networks to undertake research, and networks of networks to facilitate coordination and communication amongst these networks, and to build harmonized data collection processes and to really engage as broadly as possible. Next slide, please. Now, a very neat demonstration project for this concept is now beginning to take shape through the World Health Organization. And it's based on the concept that during the COVID-19 pandemic, oxygen as both a supportive treatment and a drug was in scarce supply, and particularly in resource-limited settings. And so the idea has emerged to conduct a globally federated research platform that will look at multiple different strategies for the ventilatory support of acutely ill patients around the world. We've been able to elicit the interest of over 80 different research networks in this particular initiative, are in the midst of ongoing discussions to establish priorities and build a governance model that will really ensure that ownership is globally distributed and that it is centered as much in the global south as it is in the global north. But I think with the imprimatur of the World Health Organization and the support of a very vibrant international group of clinical research networks, there's a real opportunity here to fundamentally change the way we think about doing research in critical illness. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, I think the big lesson of COVID-19 and the lesson that really speaks to the importance of equity and inclusion in critical care research is that we need to move to models where we go from conducting individual trials to recognizing that uncertainty is simply an element of day-to-day practice and this is particularly true in the ICU, and that the appropriate way to respond to that is to integrate research into the delivery of care. And because healthcare needs around the world, fundamental needs are universal, the approaches really need to be inclusive and universal. Next slide, please. So thanks again for the opportunity of speaking today. That's my email address if you're interested in any further information about any of these particular initiatives. Thanks again.
Thank you, Dr. Marshall. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. Next, we have Dr. Brenda Morrow. Dr. Morrow is going to present integrating cultural and resources differences when implementing guidelines. Dr. Morrow is a physiotherapist and full professor in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. She has special interest in interdisciplinary pediatric critical care practice and research, cardiopulmonary rehabilitation, palliative care, and medical ethics. She has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles and is co-editor of the textbook Cardiopulmonary Physiotherapy in Trauma, an evidence-based approach. She has written 21 book chapters and presented at numerous national and international meetings. Dr. Morrow holds a Southern African National Research Foundation B rating, and she's the immediate past president of the World Federation of Pediatric Intensive and Critical Care Societies, and currently president of the Critical Care Society in South Africa. She's currently editor-in-chief of Care Medicine and associate academic editor of PLOS ONE. She's a regular reviewer for over 40 international journals and grant funding agencies. Welcome, Dr. Morrow.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to your group tonight. It's been very eye-opening. And I hope maybe I will bring a different perspective coming as I do from South Africa, and I do see myself as an African. I have no conflicts of interest to declare in respect of this presentation. So by way of background, there is no doubt that critical care, which I'm defining as the care for people with acute life-threatening illness or injuries, is an integral part of the whole healthcare system. In high-income settings, that care usually occurs in intensive care units, but where those facilities are not available, care may be provided in very different contexts and to different levels, depending on the available human, physical, and financial resources. We know that there are huge global disparities in the prevention, early recognition, and access to critical care services. These, in addition to adverse socioeconomic circumstances, impact on patient outcomes, with the burden of disease, with morbidity and mortality very heavily skewed towards resource-limited settings, where there are also substantial challenges in the basic determinants of health, as we've also heard earlier. Research is clearly needed as well to strengthen healthcare systems. Yet in critical care generally, there is a notable gap in published research from resource-limited settings. Research output, in addition to critical care, is heavily weighted to high-income settings, and it's focused on the needs of healthcare within those settings, with a relative lack of attention to the conditions that are endemic to resource-limited settings. In fact, there is negligible published research that emerges from critical care communities in low-income countries. And there are a number of different reasons for this, including lack of critical care providers and researchers, funding, academic mentorship, research infrastructure, and barriers to developing available data into publishable research. For example, huge barriers in terms of publication bias and barriers like author processing and publication charges, which are out of reach of most people in low-income settings. I think we can all agree that delivering safe, equitable, and high-quality critical care in resource-limited settings should be seen as a global health priority. But how do we ensure delivery of this sort of evidence-based care in the absence of regionally relevant high-quality evidence? The research gap means that practitioners in poorly resourced regions, where empirical research is poorly supported, rely on studies conducted in highly disparate settings to inform their critical care practice. The problem is that if studies have not included or partnered with these different settings, we cannot assume external validity, as Dr. Marshall also said earlier. In other words, interventions that are shown to improve outcomes in patients from studies that are done in resource-rich settings may not be relevant or true for patients in low-resource settings. And we've heard this example already in terms of the higher mortality of septic children and adults treated with aggressive fluid resuscitation in Africa. And there are different reasons for that, which we obviously don't have time to go into, but it largely relates to lack of ventilatory support in the case of fluid overload. And so we really need context-specific research so that we can identify regionally relevant problems, as well as feasible and appropriate solutions to optimizing patient outcomes and improving the quality of care that is delivered in different settings. I believe strongly that supporting such work should really be high on the global critical care agenda. We need to prioritize education and capacity building. We need to provide financial support or mechanisms for financial support of research in different settings. We need to support the infrastructure, develop collaborations, partnerships, and networks, and encourage knowledge exchange with different settings. Realistically, though, it will take considerable time for resource-limited settings to get to the point where they will have conducted the necessary research to appropriately inform practice. And we cannot wait for that time to improve practice. The time is now. I would suggest, therefore, that resource-limited settings need to start where they are, do what they can, and use what they have. And one of the resources that can inform evidence-based practice is clinical practice guidelines. But these have to be adapted in order to be feasible and suitable for the specific setting, to bridge the gap between the guideline recommendations and local capabilities, while still developing local capacity and expertise to conduct research as well in that setting. Those practitioners who are going to be implementing and using the guidelines must, of course, be aware of the guideline. They need to be knowledgeable about the guideline contents and the reasons for implementing the guidelines. In order for implementation to be effective, the attitude of the clinicians using the guidelines must be supportive of implementation in order for the guidelines to successfully be used and for appropriate behavior change. There are also a number of potential external barriers from individual to policy levels that require educational, financial, organizational, and regulatory strategies and interventions. If we're looking at external barriers, in resource diverse contexts, we need to consider a number of contextual circumstances and barriers that must be taken into consideration when trying to implement guidelines and translating research to practice. These include access to critical care. Many critical care services are in centralized health facilities, and there may be unsafe or unavailable transport to access those facilities. In terms of health literacy and cultural beliefs, there may be a lack of public awareness and education of critical care and misconceptions about what that care entails, as well as fundamental distrust of Western medicine practice largely. And then there are a number of different and diverse beliefs and cultures around health, illness, and medicine that we have to respect and incorporate. Resource limitations, obvious, but it's not only financial resource limitations. It includes physical and human limitations. And we have to consider environmental factors that may impact on critical care provision and uptake, including pollution, fossil fuels, and the social determinants of health. Once a health problem has been targeted for improvement and a guideline has been identified for implementation, one of the first steps is to consider what level of care and resources are available in the context. One needs to understand this in order to determine whether the guideline would be applicable to the local context, or perhaps which aspects of the guidelines may be appropriate to implement and which may need adaptation or in fact may not be appropriate at all. This simple 4S model was actually developed for emergency outbreak response, but I like to use this model when developing or implementing any critical care intervention. We need to look at local context in terms of the space where the critical care is being delivered, the stuff, that's the equipment, monitoring, diagnostic, and therapeutic equipment that is available, healthcare systems, infrastructure, and logistics to provide the services, and the availability of appropriately trained and supported healthcare staff from all disciplines. The World Federation of Intensive Care Medicine developed a framework for stratifying ICUs on the basis of the intensity of their care that they provide. It would not be appropriate to apply guidelines for invasive ventilation in an institution that only has oxygen. ECMO would generally not be applicable at all in severely restricted settings, for example. And so we need to be realistic about what is available while obviously advocating for optimal service delivery. From a staff perspective, identifying champions and leaders is absolutely essential. We need to empower and train our workforce of critical care practitioners across the spectrum. It's been suggested that the nurses really should be the focus of attention because empowering well-trained nurses can significantly improve delivery of care and is considered an overall low-cost and effective critical care intervention. Any guideline that is applied in a disparate setting needs to be implemented carefully and ideally systematically, using a stepwise and iterative approach and carefully monitoring both the compliance to the guidelines as well as patient outcomes. Importantly, this would require an initial baseline needs analysis, evaluating the extent of the clinical problem to be addressed, as well as identifying potential barriers and solutions to implementation. For example, some aspects of the guideline may be removed if it's completely inappropriate or not feasible. Others may need modification, and still others may need to be added. One needs to choose high-impact interventions that are feasible within the available resources, whilst maintaining the core principles of the guideline. The planning stage includes resource allocation or redirection of resources, identification of teams and champions for education and for steering the implementation process. Healthcare providers during the planning stage should receive training on the health condition targeted, as well as the interventions and processes that need to be implemented. At this stage, one can also consider education on cultural competence to better understand and respect diverse cultural perspectives in the region, as well as improving communication with the caregivers and the stakeholders in order to improve the acceptability of the practice change. We then can start implementing the guideline and perhaps in a small scale project or pilot or prototype rather than implementing the entire guideline at the same time. We then need to study what has happened. What does the data tell us? What have you learned? Data analysis is essential, and the results of regular audits must be fed back to the critical care team as well, so they understand why the practice changes are necessary and to motivate them to improve further. And then this needs to be ongoing. The program can then be modified and continued. But importantly, after implementing any guideline practice changes, there needs to be a series of change cycles in which the interventions and measurements are implemented, not necessarily all at once, further refined or changed in order to improve adherence and patients' outcomes, as well as ensuring sustainability in the long term. Cultural sensitivity is also essential when implementing guidelines. Many communities lack information and understanding about Western-based medical practice, and this brings a fear of the unknown and a distrust of the health establishment. There are important community misconceptions about oxygenation and ventilation therapy, for example, and this has been reported in multiple studies in Africa specifically, where there is the not unfounded perception that oxygen kills. This is likely because of selection bias in that only the sickest patients are likely to receive oxygen in areas where this is a really scarce resource. But as a consequence, patients and families are scared. They're fearful of receiving oxygen therapy in any form. And as such, this may delay health-seeking behaviors, or stakeholders may preferentially seek alternative healthcare options, such as traditional healers, as the first point of care. We know that for any health intervention to be optimally effective, it must first be feasible to implement and administer by the healthcare personnel, and it must be acceptable to caregivers, such that health-seeking behaviors and treatment adherence is optimized. Interestingly, in the pediatric critical care environment, it's been noted that after seeing the positive effect of oxygen treatment in their own child, mothers reported that they now supported the treatment and would actually recommend it to other mothers. And this could be leveraged in community engagement and educational programs, using individuals and methods that the community are familiar with, and using methods that are appropriate to and respectful of local beliefs and customs. In this way, I believe the barrier of health literacy and beliefs can be broken down and perceptions changed, promoting health-seeking behaviors, building partnerships, including with local health organizations, with cultural experts, with community leaders, all of which can enhance the integration of critical care guidelines. If we engage with collaboration, it can ensure that the guidelines are well-informed, culturally appropriate, as well as being resource conscious. Implementing culturally sensitive care guidelines does involve engaging. It involves engaging, as I said, with the community, but also with the patients and their families to ensure that the guidelines and care plans align with their values, beliefs, needs, and preferences. The concept of patient and family-centered care can be really used in this regard. It emphasizes respecting the patient's cultural backgrounds, and this has been shown objectively to improve patient satisfaction and adherence to treatment. For children specifically, we have shown that parental engagement and participation in the care of the critically ill child is associated with reduced parental anxiety and higher satisfaction levels, and likely better acceptability of healthcare. So if we look at some examples where guidelines have been adapted to suit culturally and resource diverse settings, the obvious example that springs to my mind, because this is an area of my research interest, is acute respiratory distress syndrome. So we know that ARDS is under-recognized globally in both adult and pediatric settings, at least in part because many of the earlier definitions required invasive diagnostic methods and ventilation support. So an example of a successfully adapted guideline was from Rwanda, where the ARDS criteria, the Berlin ARDS definitions, were modified using the SF ratio and lung ultrasound requirements, rather than needing invasive blood gases and chest X-ray. And that was the local Kigali modification. There have also been other recent examples where consensus clinical guidelines have been updated with wider inclusion of experts from different sociogeographic, cultural, and professional contexts. I think this is really important, but as Dr. Marshall said, inclusion is not necessarily partnering, and I think we have a way to go to make sure that our new guidelines are truly representative of culturally and resource diverse contexts. But I do think that this sort of inclusion and partnering is an aspect that we all have a responsibility to ensure when creating new guidelines moving forwards. So in conclusion, to improve critical care globally, we need to implement appropriate evidence-based care. Clinical guidelines and strategies developed in high-income settings must be adapted to function optimally and most cost-effectively in low-resource settings, where the diagnostic, therapeutic, and monitoring technologies typically available in high-income settings are not available. By understanding cultural sensitivities, adapting to resource limitations, and employing strategies for community engagement and collaboration, I believe that healthcare systems can advance the impact of critical care guidelines and ultimately improve our outcomes for diverse patient populations. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Drs. Paquette, Marshall, and Dr. Morrow. These were excellent presentations. Recognizing we are a bit past the hour, all three of our speakers are able to stay on for a few more minutes for some questions. There are a couple of things in the chat that I believed were answered. Dr. Marshall answered where some of his data was from, as well as the healthcare spending being in adjusted per capita. There was a question for Dr. Morrow about guidelines for transferring to a higher level of care.
Can the person elaborate a little bit on what are they talking about? Applying guidelines moving that were developed in a low level of care setting and translating that upwards? Is that what they are meaning?
Yeah, this is Donna Lynch-Smith, and thank you so much. What a wonderful presentation. My question is for the COVID settings that were developed, standalones, and if somebody needed ECMO, what are the guidelines to transfer? Because, in current settings in critical care, you can only transfer if their, vital signs are X, Y, and Z. So what happens during COVID? Because I saw where people were not transferred when they could have been transferred for a higher level of care. Thank you for your conversation.
Thank you. So it was very, very challenging during COVID. I can comment on my experience in Africa, where certainly in the public health system, ECMO was not offered, and as such, transfer there was no transfer of critically ill patients in that context, even if ECMO would have been indicated. So there was a very clear triage and resource allocation for the management of patients with COVID. And it largely involved the lowest denominator and supporting, where there was invasive ventilation, it was supporting the delivery of invasive ventilation for the greatest number, for the greatest good. So really using utilitarian principles rather than individual principles and individual care. It was very challenging for people. Within the private sector, certainly in the African context, there's only a handful of centers that were able to provide ECMO. And again, a few of them were able to provide ECMO services, but it was severely limited. But overall, in low resource settings, most critical care units had to unfortunately triage patients and provide a limitation of care simply to ensure that the resources were used for the greatest good. So we were largely using justice principles in terms of distributive justice. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. If there's other questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat or raise your hand. In the interim, I had one that maybe is for both Dr. Marshall and Dr. Morrow, but thinking about how do we balance both globalization of research, but also context specifically? So I imagine, maybe platform trials are one solution, but how do we take something on a global scale, but then adapt it in terms of research trials for the context in which we're doing them, or for different contexts, really?
I mean, that's such a really important question, and one that we haven't given a lot of thought about, even within a national context, where what works in an academic center in a large city may be very different from what works in a rural center that's several hundred miles away from it. So the whole issue of heterogeneity, whether it's on the part of the patient or elements that are introduced because of disparities in access to care, I think is a critical one that really needs to be addressed as we move things forward, but one that we're only really beginning to even start to articulate what the questions are that we need to ask.
Yeah, if I can also respond there, I think that there are opportunities now with big data to really try and tease out those heterogeneities. And as you say, that it's so huge because we have clinical heterogeneity, we have geographical, we have socioeconomic, we have cultural. There are just so many factors. But I think that there is potential if we are developing global registries, for example, and we use those wisely. I think we can start to really analyze where those differences and needs lie, and we can interrogate data at different levels and relatively quickly, because they don't involve prospective clinical trials, which and there's so many, it's so difficult to implement clinical trials in resource limited settings. The one thing I do just want to mention though is, this is a challenge, is what I call helicopter research, where people want to support research in low income settings and they literally fly in, they inject some resources. The priorities are generally set in the high income settings, and they teach people and then they fly out again, but it's not building a sustainable resource infrastructure. And really what people are wanting in resource limited settings is that partnership developing, it's such that the priorities are set by the region, or global priorities are set. And then there is the global support, education, as say, equity of funding, which is a huge problem. There's so many issues to look at here. But what we're really wanting is partnership, collaboration, support. And I think that will go a long way to really improving infrastructure in resource limited settings.
Applying it to resource limited settings, one of the attractive features of research platforms is that what a particular center participates in reflects their interests and their particular needs. So in REMAP CAP, centers didn't all study the same questions. They studied the ones most relevant to their particular setting. And so our report on the use of ivermectin, 95% of the patients were recruited from Pakistan, where this was a real issue. Most research groups in upper income countries thought this was a non-question with respect to intensive care units. So I think that there are research models that actually embrace the concept that there's variability by giving the opportunity to participate in those elements that are relevant to you.
Thank you both. I think sort of all three of your talks and these answers highlight the importance of really engaging with stakeholders and maybe from the outset having a plan for sustainability moving forward, or even before implementing a research project or guidelines or an intervention.
Yeah. No, thank you. The presentations were fantastic, and I agree 100% with the comment. Brenda has a comment.
I just want to maybe just in response to Erin's talk as well, just to mention about tokenism in terms of global tokenism. And I have seen this a lot, where there is one individual from Africa, and often that's me. So I can say that I'm often used as the token because I say yes. But that is not partnership with Africa, Right. So there needs to be consideration, and in terms of gender, professions, and geographical and social regions, we need to make sure that we are not just including one face, two faces. There needs to be proper partnership and collaboration with representatives of the different stakeholder groups.
Right, that's a challenge, but you're absolutely right. Yeah. Any other comments? This was fabulous. No. So I think we will close the session. Thank you very much for your presentations. This was outstanding, and we look forward, certainly, I'm sure Ankita as well, to continue the conversation, because these are challenges that, an area that we are both interested in, and challenges that certainly we're trying to contribute to see how this big gap can be solved. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Just wanted to echo thank you, everyone, and apologies for running over time, but appreciate everyone sticking around and hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Thank you.
Thank you.